Dr. Monteith, can I ask you real quick? It seems
Sure.
like to me that, and you are a real pioneer in this area because, as I've mentioned, myself and others before me actually sort of followed in your footsteps in being able to turn over these rocks and look at these areas and debunk a lot of the paradigms and the presumptions that we've had growing up in the very sheltered environment we've been in. It seems to me that we have grown up in a culture, and I'm just speaking about America right now. It's a wonderful country. I think you would agree with me. You love this country, want the best for it. You're thankful and grateful to God for the gift of it and the freedoms that are here. But that we have been sort of programmed in our books and sometimes in our churches to have a certain worldview of who our enemies are, what is really going on, what current events are really happening just of their own merit and not being manipulated, and what it appears to me what you found, and I'm seeing more and more people find, and I try to cover on this show just like you do in yours, is that you find behind the scenes that we have enemies that we don't often understand before we're really who our enemies are. I'm talking enemies of decent people, and particularly Christian folk. They're people who have a smile on their face and may pat us on the back, particularly people of faith. But they're people who are behind the scenes, and if you do a little research and wake up out of your slumber, you find out are actually working and colluding with others to do things that would confirm our worst fears. And we find that often that the people who have been set up to be our enemies are people who they have purposely set up and manipulated in that light to actually manipulate us and to get us to a stage where we adopt their long-term worldview. And once you start going down this road, you start upsetting the apple cart of all the things that you thought were near and dear, and it completely changes your worldview. And it's a reminder as a Christian that while we're very, very blessed to be in, again, our country we are, and it's good to be patriotic, we find that all the kingdoms of this world are in essence evil, and it's going to an ultimate end game, and we should never get confused with the kingdom of God and our service of the Lord Jesus Christ and what's going on with the nations of this world. Would you agree? Is that sort of generally the path that we're all starting to follow down?
Absolutely. And the thing is that I start my programs every day with the phrase, reality is usually scoffed at. Illusion is usually king. But in the battle for survival of Western civilization, it's going to be reality, not illusion or delusion, that'll determine what the future will bring. And that's really so true. Most of what we think we believe isn't true. Most people believe that communism, was the enemy, and we certainly the communists were evil and horrible and brutal, and that's absolutely true. But what people have missed is the fact that communism from its inception has been financed by people here in the United States. Mm-hmm. And why? Well, first of all, it was a social experiment, and they could use the people there, the enslaved people, for all sorts of little tricks and programs, and we used the people of Russia, for instance, for trying our polio vaccine before they ever gave it here in the United States. Of course, they only later found out there was a cancer virus in the polio virus that they gave the Russian people and the American people. In fact, there's a book put out by the National Institute of Health, actually supported by them, called The Health Century, and you hear these wicked people laughing at the plight of the Russians who were infected with the cancer viruses and how their athletes won't be very good in the future because they'll have to carry around all these big tumors that are going to be created by the vaccines we use on them. But people do not understand that from the very inception of communism back in 1918, why it was financed by the United States, by our Federal Reserve Board, by American capitalists, and we carry a number of books on this.
And you have documents. You have extensive proof and documents that verify this.
And people who have even been part of the communist movement who've come out and said, I suddenly realized that I thought I was fighting the evil system here, and I found out that communism was controlled by the same I was fighting here. That's the story of Bella Dodd, who was an official in the Communist Party, and we tell her story in my book, Brotherhood of Darkness, and she actually wrote a book about it, where she'd been a dedicated communist, totally dedicated. She was a lawyer, totally dedicated to communism and the destruction of America, but during the Second World War, when it was just beginning, she asked from the high communist officials what they would do if they lost contact with the Central Committee of the Communist Party in Russia, and the Russian officials said, you just go over to the Waldorf Astoria Hotel and you talk to this man and this man and this man, and these were three of the leading capitalists in America. And suddenly she realized that they were the ones who were directing communist policy. And of course, you have to understand that nothing is as it appears to be. And why today, for instance? I mean, to give you an example of today, why today is the United States doing everything we can to build up communist China? Why is the World Bank, the International Monetary Fund, the Asian Development Bank, the East Asian Development Bank, American corporations, American banks like Goldman Sachs, General Motors is the largest automotive producer in communist China today. Why are they transferring our factories to communist China and making this brutal dictatorship work more efficiently?
Dr. Monteith, if I could give an example of what you're talking about, I purchased your book, Brotherhood of Darkness, and began reading it, and I thought I had seen and heard everything. And if people look at the archive of our show, they'll know we've covered everything but the kitchen sink. But when I started reading and related to this Chinese issue, I was shocked when you actually put in just one of many examples in your book, actual narrative from the congressional record that shows that our President Truman and Congress purposely cut off the supplies and support for Chiang Kai-shek and the anti-communist fighters and supported Chairman Mao at a critical stage and actually supported them getting into power. Am I saying this correctly? Our supposed
Absolutely.
bitter enemy was actually someone who our own government and people put into place in power.
Absolutely. In fact, it was David Rockefeller, after he returned from communist China in 1973, who wrote an article in the New York Times in which he said, of course there's been some brutality over in China. Of course, he didn't mention they'd killed, by this time, about 100 million people, including the 40 million they starved to death between 58 and 62. But he's writing in 73, and he's saying, but the social experiment in China is one of the most important and successful in history. The social experiment in China is one of the most important and successful in history. And of course, David Rockefeller is certainly far more wealthy than Bill Gates and Nelson and certainly Warren Buffett. Their family is certainly the most powerful organization in the United States, the wealthiest, one of the three wealthiest families in the world. But they're not going to let the American people know that. David Rockefeller is a member, actually he's the honorary chairman of the Council on Foreign Relations. He organized the Trilateral Commission. He's attended every meeting of the Bilderbergers for 54 years. David Rockefeller, of course, and his family are deeply involved in the occult, but they cannot let the American people know that. They've suppressed this information for a long period of time. But then this is true with Henry Ford. He was deeply involved in the occult, as was Andrew Carnegie. And this is how all of these people and all of these families have amassed their wealth, because there is a supernatural power that you can tap into that will give you great wealth. In fact, if you remember the story of Jesus on the Mount of Temptation, where the devil says to him simply, kneel down and worship me, and I give you all the kingdoms of the earth. Kneel down and worship me, and I can give you all the kingdoms of the earth. Either the devil was lying or he controlled the kingdoms of the earth and the wealth of this earth. And I think he did at that time. I think he still does. And God has allowed this because, of course, God's plan is unfolding for us this very day. And, of course, many times God uses organized evil to accomplish his goal, not intentionally, but he gives man knowing full well that men, of course, will be evil and will do evil things. And we're moving into a crisis situation here in the United States, the collapse of our economy, wars, disease, famines. The American people have no idea what lies ahead, but maybe if they read the Revelation 6:8, and I looked, and behold, a pale horse, and the rider upon him was death, and Hades followed close behind, and power was given unto them to kill a quarter of the population of the earth, with war and with famine and with pestilence and with the beasts of this world.
Dr. Monteith, another area that's mentioned in there, of course, you're talking about the four horsemen. I was just doing some research in this area. The second horseman is the what I see as representing tyrannical civil government that creates wars all over the globe and massive bloodshed. And then you have the third horse that comes out with the scales in the writer's hands, which are meeting out. Looks like money changers, basically controlling world currency and controlling flow of food. But I also found that term for scale in the Greek also means a yoke. And it's a yoke that was actually put on slaves back in that day in the original Greek. And I can't see a better expression of the corporate masters that you're talking about that at their own whims put economic yokes on whatever parts of the world they choose to exploit at the time. And it will only get worse, like we see later in Revelation at the great city Babylon, when they deal with all these commodities, including the souls of men, and until they're vanquished in a day's time. So I find this fascinating, but what frustrates me the most, and I'd like your comment, I wanted to ask you later on this, but I think this is a good time to discuss it. The people group, and maybe I'm just harder on them than I am others, but those that I find that are slumbering the deepest and who swallow the words that we're given in our media the most, sometimes are our own evangelical Christian community. We're told by our media and by our political agents who our enemies are, who we're supposed to hate, who we're supposed to like, who we're supposed to attack, who are the good guys. There are artificial battles set up between political parties that we vigorously join into, and then they sit back and laugh at us while we presume that some of them are on our side. And we live in this slumber, and I'm afraid that Christians as a whole are much more naive about the information you're talking about than others. Do you agree with me in that respect?
Well,
and what is the antidote to that?
Well, all we can do, of course, is hope to educate people and get them to see the big picture and understand that this is a spiritual battle being fought on a political, ideological, cultural, financial, educational battlefield. But behind everything are these powerful spiritual forces. And certainly, I mean, I was part of the group of evangelical Christians, about 25 to 30 people, who were gotten together and recruited to pick the next president of the United States in 1999. And we met with George Herbert Walker Bush. And I will have to admit that there were only two of us, myself and John Stormer, who was with me, of this group of wonderful, wonderful people who loved the Lord, who saw through George Bush and realized that we were getting a terrible, terrible problem. And because George Bush looked in my eyes when I asked him a question, and we each got to ask one question, and he simply lied to me. And I knew he was lying to me. And why would a man lie? He was professing his Christianity, telling how, of course, he'd become a Christian. Billy Graham had led him to the Lord. And my goodness, you know, if we challenged what George Bush was saying, it was like we were challenging Billy Graham. But unfortunately, George Bush has done more to damage Christianity throughout the world than anybody I know. Certainly when people look at the torture and the wars and the aggression and the oppression of people exerted by the current administration, the people of Iraq don't want us over there. They keep asking us to leave, and we won't leave. But that's not what our government says. Oh, well, we've got to have victory. We can't leave it. We shouldn't have gone in the first place. And if we did go in the first place, we shouldn't have, you know, as soon as we'd gotten control of the country, why, of course, we could have turned it over to the patriotic Iraqis. And, of course, you know, and instead of that, we dissolved their army, we dissolved their police force, we dissolved their civil service, we shut down their schools and their hospitals and their factories, threw everybody out of work, we created chaos, so we could justify staying over there. But the average American doesn't understand that. We didn't go there to win. We are not trying to win the war over in Iraq or Afghanistan. Anybody who questions that, I suggest they go to my website at radioliberty.com, and there in December of 2007, my newsletter. December of 2007, my Radio Liberty newsletter. It's up on my website.
And we'll have your link on futurequake.com, if that's all right.
That's fine. I appreciate that. But basically, we published the speech that was given by Lieutenant General Ricardo Sanchez, who commanded the coalition forces in Iraq from June of 2003 to June of 2004. And as you read it, you want to weep. Because he says over and over again, we weren't allowed to win the war. We weren't allowed to win the war. And I have a series of interviews with Lieutenant General Sanchez, a great patriot, a great warrior, and a man who suddenly realizes that that he was betrayed by the leaders of this country and by his fellow people within the military.